Now, I want to emphasize, before I go into the 4 E's, that when I did my investigation, I did not give the Bible any special credibility. I didn't consider it to be inerrant, inspired, the Word of God. I do now, but I was a skeptic then. But I had to accept the New Testament for what it undeniably is, which is a set of ancient historical writings. And I knew, just as you can investigate any ancient writings, whether they're by Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius, you can take those same investigative techniques and apply them to the documents of the New Testament to try to determine, are they telling me the truth? So in other words, I didn't just open the Bible and says, oh, Jesus was resurrected, end of story. I wanted to dig beneath that. How do I know it really happened? So what is the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead and thus prove that he is who he claimed to be? Well, the 4 E's start this way. The first E stands for the word execution. You got to have a death, right, before you can have a resurrection. And what I found very quickly in my investigation is there is no dispute among scholars in the field about the execution of Jesus Christ under Pontius Pilate. It is just not in dispute. And I don't mean just among Christian scholars. I'm talking about the wide range of scholarship. There is virtual unanimity around the planet on this issue. Why? Because when we study ancient history, we're lucky if we have one or maybe 2 sources to confirm a fact. And yet, for the execution of Jesus by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, we not only have multiple early first century accounts of this in the documents that make up the New Testament, we've also got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating his execution. We have Josephus, a first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans. Tacitus, another early historian. Lucian, Bar Serapion. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was executed. This is so well established of an historical fact, you would get laughed out of a major academic institution if you somehow claim, no, Jesus didn't get executed. In fact, the evidence is so convincing that you can go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann of Vanderbilt University, and he will tell you this about what the evidence is. Quote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Indisputable. Now, I don't know how much you've studied ancient history, but there are very few facts in ancient history that a critical, skeptical, atheist historian like a Gerd Ludemann will say is indisputable. One of them is the execution of Jesus. The first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E, I think, is the most fascinating. It stands for the word early. We have early accounts or early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that come virtually immediately after his execution. Why is that important? Because like a lot of skeptics, I used to think that the resurrection of Jesus was merely a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, legends began to develop. Stories began to be invented. Mythologies began to be spun. Oh, there was this Jesus. Really? Oh, yeah, great guy. Lived in the first century. Really? Oh, yeah. You know, he rose from the dead. Seriously? Oh, yeah. And I thought they just kind of made this stuff up. But what I learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is merely a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed, a statement of conviction of the earliest church. In other words, the first century Christians rallied around this creed based on facts that they knew to be true. Now, this creed summarizes the resurrection and the essentials of Christianity. Now, the Apostle Paul preserves it for us in a letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth. We call this letter 1 Corinthians. And this creed is found in 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3. Let me read you what it says. Paul writes, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." Now let's stop there. This is technical rabbinic language. This is a rabbi or a teacher would use this language when he's saying, look, I am taking this sacred tradition, this creed, and it's so important, I'm not going to mess with it. I just want to turn and pass it on to you. And notice he said, I passed it on. So previously, on a previous visit, he had already passed on this creed, but he's going to repeat it in this letter. So what does the creed say? That Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, and some have died. Let's stop there. So what they're saying is, look, you don't believe us about the resurrection? There's 500 people who are eyewitnesses. Go talk to them. They're still living. They're still around. Then it goes on. Then he appeared to James. Stop there. James was a skeptic about Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. And yet, he ends up dying, being executed as a leader of the church. What changed him from skeptic to leader of the church? The resurrected Jesus, it said, appeared to him. And then it says he appeared to all the apostles. And then Paul adds, and last of all, he appeared to me also. Now, this report of the resurrection, naming eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses, what's important is how immediately this developed after the death of Jesus. Remember we said it took time for legend to develop, right? Okay. Dr. Gary Habermas, a historian in this area who I interviewed for my book, The Case for Christ, has developed this timeline to help us understand how early this creed developed. We know historically that Paul wrote this letter to the church in Corinth within 22 to 25 years of the death of Jesus. And he says he passed on this creed earlier. So sometime before then, let's say 20 years after the death of Jesus, this creed was already in existence. Now, if we stop there, that would be pretty impressive anyway, 20 years between the event and the creed. Because when you think about it, the first two biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch were written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. So 20 years or so is pretty impressive, but we can go back earlier than that. Because Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, a hater of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. There are scholars who believe this was when he was given this creed that he later writes to the church in Corinth. But others say, no, it was probably 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem and meets for 15 days with two people specifically named in the creed, Peter and James. And the Greek word that Paul uses to describe this meeting, hysterio, suggests that this was not a meeting where they were talking about the weather or about baseball or something. It was an investigative inquiry. What do you know? What did you see? They're checking each other out. And most scholars will say this was when he was given the creed by two people named in the creed. But either way, it means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. So the point is, there is no huge time gap between the death of Jesus and this belief, this conviction, this report that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. In fact, one of the great scholars in this area, James D.G. Dunn, writes this. This tradition, and by this tradition he means this creed, this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of Jesus' death. Within months. Friends, this is historical gold. It would be unprecedented in the history of the world for a legend to develop that fast and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. In fact, one of the greatest historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford, he studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he determined that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash, goes right back to the beginning. And it's not the only early report we've got. We've got others right there from the first century, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, other writings of Paul, all of which date back so early. They were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. Friends, we got an execution. Jesus was dead. We've got reports of his resurrection that come so early, so immediately after the event. You can't just write them off as saying they're legend. But that's not all we've got. We've got a third E, stands for the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. It was sealed. Matthew tells us it was guarded, and yet it was discovered empty on that first Easter morning. Now, we could spend the rest of the day talking about all the strands of historical evidence that establish that the tomb was empty. But I'm just going to give you one fact, because to me, this is conclusive. And that's this. Even the enemies of Jesus implicitly admitted that the tomb of Jesus was empty. How do we know? Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents of Jesus never said was, baloney, go open the tomb, you'll find the body. That's all they needed to say, because it would have put the onus on the disciples to prove it. But they didn't say that. What did they say? Well, we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, what the opponents said was, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. What is that? That's a cover story. They're implicitly conceding the tomb is empty, but they're trying to explain how it got empty by blaming it on the disciples. See what I'm saying? It's like if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework. That student is implicitly admitting, look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it. It's the same thing. So either implicitly or explicitly, the enemies, the supporters of Jesus are all conceding that the tomb was empty. I don't think that was the issue of history. I think the issue of history really is, how did it get empty? And you go through the usual list of suspects. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The religious leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive. They didn't have the means, and they didn't have the opportunity. I think the best explanation for the tomb of Jesus being empty is that he rose from the dead, especially when we combine it with the fourth word that begins with the letter E, which is the word eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. To skeptics and opponents and doubters, as well as to believers. To men, to women, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. To groups, to individuals. People talked with them. They touched him. They ate with them. I mean, think of this. Remember we said we're lucky in ancient history if we have one or maybe two sources to confirm a fact? Well, get this. For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating their conviction that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. And it changed the disciples. Changed them from being cowards and afraid that they were going to get executed, hiding. And history shows us that just a short time later, in the very same city where Jesus was put to death, these once cowardly disciples are now proclaiming with boldness that Jesus not only claimed to be the Son of God, he backed it up by returning from the dead. And we have 7 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament that tell us that they lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of that proclamation. Why were they willing to do that? Not because they just had faith that Jesus rose from the dead. Not because someone told them it was true. Not because they heard it on the radio. Not because a Sunday school teacher told them. But because of all the human beings who've ever lived, they were in a position to know for a fact whether Jesus had appeared from the dead or whether it was a lie. And knowing it was true, they were willing to suffer for their proclamation that he had risen. That tells me something about the sincerity of their convictions. Friends, I spent 2 years of my life investigating the minutia of the resurrection of Jesus. And it all came down to a Sunday afternoon. And I remember I went alone in my bedroom. And I thought, a good jury reaches a verdict. And I'd been stuffing my head for 2 years with all this data, all this evidence. And I thought, I got to reach a verdict. I got to reach a conclusion. How do I do that? So I decided to take a yellow legal pad. And I thought, I'm just going to write out in longhand a summary of the evidence, pro and con, everything that I've seen in 2 years. Just get it down on paper. So I started writing page after page after page after page after page after page. And finally, I put down my pen and I said, well, wait a second. In light of the avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully toward the truth of Christianity, I realized it would take more faith for me to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. I'm just saying. So for me, I concluded, based on the evidence of history, that Jesus not only claimed to be the Son of God, he backed it up by returning from the dead.